My name is Marcus Alvarez, and if you can hear these words, I'm broadcasting from the heart of what used to be downtown Chicago, on a frequency once known as 103.8 FM WCTD radio. The sign above the studio door still reads "On Air," even though most of the city has gone silent. I'm not sure how far this signal reaches anymore. Maybe just a few blocks, or maybe it manages to drift across the rooftops and highways far beyond the skyline. I hope it does. I hope someone out there can still tune in, because I need you to know that there are survivors. I need you to know that we haven't given up. I never planned on becoming a voice in the dark. For most of my life, I was a quiet producer and sound tech, working behind the scenes. My dream had always been to help craft stories, not to be the one telling them. You wouldn't have heard my name or recognized my face, but everything changed when the city fell. Suddenly, it was just me, a half-functional radio station, and the will to stay alive long enough to keep talking. Maybe you're tuning in for the first time, so let me share how it all began, from my own perspective. I was born and raised here in Chicago, in a cramped apartment near Logan Square. Even as a kid, I loved the bustle of the city, the elevated trains rattling overhead, the hum of traffic, the swirl of languages and cultures on every block. My parents, Manuel and Rosa Alvarez, worked long hours. He was a CTA mechanic. She was a nursing assistant at a rehabilitation clinic. When I was about 10, I started playing with an old tape recorder, making little radio shows in my room, complete with fake commercials and interviews with my stuffed animals. That fascination never left me, and by the time I made it to college, I knew I wanted to be part of the radio world in some form. Not necessarily on the mic, but creating soundscapes, editing interviews, being the person who makes the stories come alive in your ears. I landed a job at WCTD a few years ago, starting as a junior production assistant. Eventually, I worked my way up to a producer role, focusing on local talk segments. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I'd cut my teeth on everything from morning drive news bites to late-night call-in shows, sometimes working weird hours, always behind the scenes with headphones clamped around my ears. The best part of my day was usually heading home to my fiancée, Diana. We'd gotten engaged just 2 months before everything happened. She was a paramedic with the Chicago Fire Department, dedicated, fearless, the kind of person who'd run headlong into a crisis to help people. My heart would glow whenever I saw her cresting our front steps in her uniform. I used to say, "Diana, you're the real hero around here," and she'd just laugh, telling me she was no hero, just a woman who cared. We thought we'd have a normal life together, saving for a wedding, maybe a modest one at the Garfield Park Conservatory, then moving into a slightly bigger apartment, eventually buying a place if we managed to scrape together enough. We never pictured an apocalypse. We never pictured the city we loved turning into something unrecognizable. I don't know exactly when the infection first arrived or who patient zero might have been. I do know that about 3 weeks before the total collapse, there were rumors floating around the newsroom. Strange, frantic calls to local hospitals about rabid patients. Unconfirmed stories of violent encounters in the South Side neighborhoods. We gave it some coverage, but the local authorities brushed it off, an overreaction, they said, or a new strain of something that public health officials could contain. So we moved on to the next story, the next talk segment, the next city council scandal. That was how it went in the news cycle. Always something else to discuss. But the calls kept coming, and the rumors got louder. On the morning of August 1st, we received a city bulletin. Due to public safety concerns, residents in certain areas are advised to remain indoors. We read it on air, but we had few details. Diana texted me from her ambulance. Strange cases. People not responding to normal meds. Super aggressive. I texted back, "Be safe. See you tonight." I had no idea how huge this would become, how those few words might be the last normal exchange we'd ever share. By August 2nd, it was clear something big was happening. The phone lines at the station started blowing up with people describing scenes right out of a nightmare. Neighbors attacking neighbors, refusing to go down even when they were badly hurt, ignoring pain. We tried to get official statements from the mayor's office, the police, the medical centers. All we got were short press releases telling people to shelter in place and wait for assistance. Some mention of an unknown pathogen. Then the calls began mentioning the word zombie, usually with a nervous laugh, as if the caller couldn't believe they were saying it. None of us at the station wanted to label it that way. Too sensational. Too reminiscent of bad horror movies. But at some point, no other words seemed to fit. We were dealing with people who'd lost themselves to some infection, as if they existed only to spread it through bites or direct contact. On August 3rd, Diana sent me a text around dawn. "Stuck at the hospital. City's overwhelmed. Not sure when I can leave. Please, stay at the station if you can. Promise me. D." My hands shook when I read it. I typed back, "I promise, I love you." She never replied. That entire day, I kept expecting her to walk through the doors of WCTD, exhausted but alive, eager for a hug. She never came. Everything unraveled at terrifying speed. The staff at WCTD tried to keep order. We had a news director, Kevin Harland, who was practically living in the station, barking out assignments, yelling for more coffee. But the city's emergency lines crashed. The official bulletins stopped. Helicopters roared overhead, shining searchlights on the streets at night, then vanished as quickly as they'd come. One by one, my co-workers left, hoping to find their families or evacuate to rumored shelters near the University of Chicago. Kevin himself departed with the group on August 5th, telling me, "Marcus, come on, you can't stay. This is crazy." But I said I had to wait for Diana. The station was a designated emergency broadcast channel. If she was out there, she'd know to find me, or at least tune in. So I let Kevin go, and that was the last I ever saw of him. By August 6th, I was alone. The station's generator kicked in when the city's power grid failed, but it had limited fuel. I taught myself how to route just enough power to keep the broadcasting equipment running, sacrificing overhead lights and air conditioning. My entire world became that console, that microphone, the emergency lights flickering in a hallway, and the faint beep of the backup system struggling to hold on. That was when I started speaking on air under my own name. Believe me, it felt strange. I'd always been the quiet one behind the scenes, editing sound clips or timing segments for the talk hosts, but there was no one else left to talk. So I slid on my old, battered headphones, took a shaky breath, and flipped the on-air switch. My first words were stammered but genuine. "Good morning, Chicago. This is Marcus Alvarez at WCTD Radio 103.8 FM. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but if you can, please know you're not alone." My voice trembled. My hands were slick with sweat, but I kept talking, sharing what rumors and scraps of data I had. I told them about the curfew notices, the alleged military checkpoints near the bridges, the virus that had spread beyond all containment. I tried to keep it calm, but inside I was terrified. In those first solo days, a handful of phone calls still slipped through to the station. Some were sobbing neighbors begging for help. Some were angry demands. Where is the government? Why aren't they doing anything? Some were quiet, heartbreakingly quiet, from people saying goodbye to loved ones. I pleaded with them to stay on the line, to share any locations of safe havens. We started building a mental map of the city's chaos. Then, around August 8th, even those calls stopped. The phone line went dead, and I realized I was truly isolated. I took stock of the building. The Metcalf building, which housed WCTD's offices on the 14th floor, was mostly deserted. I walked through corridors lit only by the occasional emergency bulb. The lower floors smelled of stale air, old carpeting, and sometimes something worse, like rotting garbage or that metallic tang that comes when someone's been hurt. I found shattered windows on the 3rd floor and signs of a break-in. It took me a solid hour to steel myself enough to check the basement for extra fuel. That was when I encountered my first infected up close. She was in a janitorial uniform, leaning against the wall. At first glance, I thought she was just a sick person who needed help. Then she turned, and I saw the blankness in her eyes, the way her body jerked unnaturally. I whispered, "Ma'am, are you—" But she lunged toward me. I could see dried blood on her face. I backed away, heart pounding. I had no real weapon, just a sturdy flashlight. She stumbled, tried to latch onto me. I swung, more out of panic than anything else, and caught her shoulder. She barely seemed to register pain. She just kept coming. I ducked around her, sprinted for the stairwell, and slammed the metal door behind me. I heard her banging on the other side, but I didn't stop until I reached the 10th floor, gasping for breath. That was the night I realized I couldn't keep venturing down there without better protection, and that the building was no longer safe if more infected could get in. I found a length of metal pipe in a supply closet, something I could swing if I had to. I hated the thought of hurting anyone, even these horrifying husks of who they once were. But I had no choice. It was life or death now. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I broadcast another update, my voice shaking, telling any listeners that the infected were in the Metcalf building, that I didn't know how long I could stay. The generator fuel was almost gone when I found Joseph Bryant. That was August 11th. I was rummaging for vending machine snacks on the 12th floor, moving quietly, pipe in hand, when I heard a voice behind me say, "Hey, who's there?" I whipped around, nearly whacking him with my pipe. He shouted, "Don't!" And we stood there, both terrified, both breathing hard. Joe was maybe in his late 30s, wearing a dirty jacket that said maintenance staff. He'd worked in the building. apparently got stranded when the crisis hit and had been hiding in the basement levels. He'd heard my voice once or twice on the radio, but he wasn't sure if it was pre-recorded or live. When he ran out of supplies, he'd crept upstairs hoping to find something to eat or a sign of other survivors. Instead, he found me. And we sort of stared at each other, trying to figure out if we were safe to be around, if the other was infected. Finally, Joe asked, "Are you normal?" And I managed a short laugh. I guess as normal as anyone can be. We were both on edge, but we also felt a rush of relief. We weren't alone. We introduced ourselves properly, then decided to barricade the corridor so we'd have a secure place to rest. We dragged some tables and chairs from the offices, blocking off the main hallway. We shared our stories. He'd been at home when the outbreak started, but came to work for his shift. By the time he tried to leave, the streets below were full of chaos, and the building locked down. He couldn't get past the hordes. He'd been surviving on the basement's vending machines and break room supplies for days. That same night, I brought him to the broadcast booth. The flickering emergency light gave everything a weird, ominous glow, but at least it was a space we could lock from the inside. I flipped on the microphone, introduced Joe to any audience that might still be out there. "This is Marcus, joined now by Joe Bryant, another survivor here in the Metcalf building. We're trying to hold on. If anyone can hear us, if you have information on safe zones or shelters, we're listening. Please hang on." I paused, took a breath, then added, "Diana, if you're out there, I'm still here. I love you. I'll keep waiting." That became our routine. I'd do a broadcast whenever we could spare the generator. Joe would stand nearby with the metal pipe in case an infected wandered in. Then we'd talk about our next steps. Should we stay or try to leave? The building was big, but eventually we'd run out of supplies. Joe pointed out we could check the office floors for anything left behind: canned goods, water bottles, first aid kits. We did so very carefully, day by day. Sometimes we'd hear moans in the distance and freeze, hearts hammering. More than once we narrowly avoided an infected staggering out of a side corridor, but we managed to find a modest cache of snacks and sodas, plus a few jugs of water, enough to keep us going for a bit. On August 13th, we discovered a shortwave radio in the old engineering booth. It still had batteries, so I fiddled with it, scanning for signals. We heard mostly static, but occasionally faint bursts of speech, a frantic voice saying, "National Guard, I-294, perimeter," or a coded message that sounded official. Over the next couple of days, we realized there might still be some organized presence outside the city. Maybe the suburbs were less overwhelmed. The question became, how would we get there? Downtown was a war zone, and we had no illusions about safe passage. That same shortwave scanning revealed something else. We might not be the only survivors in our immediate area. On the night of August 14th, I picked up a faint signal from a building across the street. It wasn't a standard broadcast, just someone tapping on a microphone. I tapped back on ours, hoping they'd hear. We repeated this for a few minutes. Joe and I stood by the window with flashlights, shining them toward the adjacent skyscraper. Eventually, we saw a flicker of light in response. Real people. Real survivors. We tried Morse code, but neither of us knew more than an SOS. Still, we got enough back and forth to suspect they wanted to make contact. The next day, I posted a large red banner outside our 14th floor window that read, in big block letters, 103.8 WCTD. That evening, from their building, we saw an identical banner appear. "We see you." It turned out the folks inside that building were three people: Bethany Leary, an office manager who'd been leading the building's last holdouts; Jordan Carter, an electrician contracted for some renovations; and Travis Smith, a college intern from a law firm on the lower floors. Like Joe and me, they'd been scraping by on leftover supplies. They had a small rooftop greenhouse that some eco-conscious company had set up. This provided them with a few fresh peppers and tomatoes, enough to keep scurvy at bay. For a few days, we just signaled across the street, unsure if we could safely cross. But on August 17th, just before dawn, we took the risk. Joe and I carried the metal pipe and a makeshift shield made from a trash can lid. We slipped out a side door that opened onto a back alley, stepping carefully around broken glass and debris. The morning air was eerily still. A few infected wandered on the main street, but we stuck to the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. When we reached the other building, Travis was waiting at a side entrance, letting us in with trembling hands. We hurried upstairs to the 12th floor and found Bethany and Jordan in a well-barricaded conference room. They looked about as stunned as we felt. Actual conversation with another group of survivors. It seemed too good to be true. We spent an hour sharing stories. They told us about the greenhouse on the roof, how they'd tried to expand it but lacked enough seeds or materials. We told them about the radio station and the near-empty generator. They had minimal electricity from an old battery system, not enough to broadcast, but enough to keep a few lights going if they were conservative. We realized we might help each other. We had a working transmitter. They had a bit of fresh produce. Our building was closer to the main roads if we decided to attempt an escape. Their building was still mostly free of infected, thanks to well-barricaded exits. After some discussion, we decided to move them over to the Metcalf building. There was a debate about which building was safer, but I felt it was important to maintain the broadcast as a beacon of hope for anyone else in the area. Bethany agreed, saying, "If someone's searching for survivors, that broadcast might be their guiding star." So we agreed on a plan. They'd pack up their essential items and some greenhouse plants across just before dawn, and we'd set them up on the top floors of WCTD's building. The night after that meeting, Joe and I returned to the station with a renewed sense of purpose. We broadcast that a small group was forming, 5 people determined to hold out and possibly find a way to escape the city. On August 18th, around 4 a.m., Bethany, Jordan, and Travis carefully transported themselves and their supplies. We escorted them through darkened streets, hugging the walls. We had one close call with 3 infected near a crashed taxicab, but we slipped behind a row of dumpsters until they shambled away. The 5 of us finally reached the Metcalf building's side door, hearts pounding. Once inside, we barricaded the entrance behind us, stepping over broken glass from some earlier intrusion. Jordan muttered, "This is insane," but I saw determination in his eyes. Now, with 5 survivors, the top floors of WCTD felt almost alive again. We had short staff meetings in the break room, where we'd discuss rationing, shifts for lookout duty, potential supply runs. The station had a rooftop access, and Jordan was able to set up a few extra containers to catch rainwater, using his electrician skills to improvise piping. Bethany used her organizational prowess to label every supply we had, from bottled water to instant coffee. Travis, being younger and more agile, often scouted rooms we hadn't checked yet, searching for anything we missed. Joe was a steady presence, offering to handle the riskier tasks if needed. And I was the voice. I would go on air, sometimes joined by the others, letting the city know we existed. It was around this time that we first heard a rumor on the shortwave about some safe zone near O'Hare International Airport. Cargo terminal, they said. Some National Guard presence. Another rumor spoke of a place in the far suburbs where survivors were gathering at a high school. We had no way to confirm these, but hope flickered. If we could only get a vehicle or find enough fuel. But that was a tall order in a city that had ground to a halt. The CTA trains were no longer running, and the roads were jammed with abandoned cars. We weighed the risk of traveling on foot. With a group of 5, we'd surely make noise. Another fear. If these rumors proved false, we'd be lost in the streets or pinned down by the infected. We held on a bit longer in the Metcalf building, trying to make it more defensible. But on August 20th, we had a serious problem. Our generator was almost out of diesel, and the infected had begun gathering near the lobby. We weren't sure why. Maybe they heard us moving around inside, or they were just drawn to any sign of life. We sealed the stairwell doors as best we could, stacked furniture, hammered boards across the frames, but the banging sounds grew at night. We couldn't stay forever. We braced for a breach. Sure enough, on August the 23rd, they shattered the main lobby doors. A wave of moaning and scraping rose up the stairwell. We retreated to the 14th floor. Joe had constructed a secondary barricade at the 11th floor to slow them, but we knew it was only a matter of time if we stayed. That night, the 5 of us huddled in the broadcast booth, deciding our fate. Travis said, "We have to go. We can't stay here." Bethany nodded grimly. Jordan and Joe looked to me for final confirmation. I felt torn, because leaving meant severing the one direct link I had to Diana. This station was the place she knew to find me. But survival was paramount. If she was alive, she'd want me to keep going, find safety. So I said, "Okay, we'll pack up. We'll leave tomorrow night." It took us 2 days to gather everything. We located a portable transmitter in the station's engineering closet, which we could power with a car battery or any generator we found later. We stuffed backpacks with essential food, water, medical supplies, seeds from the greenhouse, and tools. We left behind anything we couldn't carry. Then, on August 26th, I made one final broadcast from the Metcalf building, my voice raw with emotion. This is Marcus Alvarez on 103.8 FM, possibly for the last time from this studio. To anyone listening, we're evacuating. The infected have overtaken the lower floors. If you can reach the Metcalf building safely, you'll find some supplies, but we can't hold it anymore. We're heading west, searching for any functioning safe zone. Diana, if you're somehow hearing this, I love you. Always. I'm sorry I can't wait here any longer. I switched off the equipment, took one last look at the studio that had been my second home, and walked out. We climbed to the rooftop, because from there we had a plan. The neighboring building's roof was just close enough that we could place a plank and cross over. We did so cautiously, each person inching over the gap. One misstep would have sent us plummeting to the alley below. My heart hammered as I placed my foot on that unsteady plank, backpack weighing me down. But we all made it across without incident, pulled the plank after us, and descended into the other building. We left by a different side exit, hoping the infected in our own lobby wouldn't notice. Downtown Chicago was a graveyard of shattered glass, overturned cars, and sporadic fires that no one was left to extinguish. We pressed ourselves against walls, scanning for infected. They wandered in clusters, 5 or 6 at a time, down the main roads. We stuck to alleyways, hopping fences, picking our way through the debris. Jordan carried the portable transmitter in a padded bag, while Travis carried a shortwave set. Bethany carried a metal baseball bat she'd found. Joe held his trusty pipe, and I had a crowbar. We'd turned from random office workers and a producer into a ragtag squad, each one responsible for the others. Alright, progress was slow. More than once, we had to flatten ourselves behind dumpsters or crouch behind battered vehicles as infected trudged past, moaning. At times, we heard distant screams that ended abruptly. At night, we found a half-collapsed motel to hide in, barricading the doors with mattresses. Bethany insisted on a watch rotation, so 2 of us would stay awake while the others slept. When it was my turn, I'd stare at the city skyline, faintly visible through a broken window, and wonder if I'd ever see that old life again. Sometimes I whispered Diana's name into the darkness, imagining her voice saying, "It's okay, Marcus, I'm still here," but it was only silence. In the days that followed, we worked our way west, crossing the Chicago River near the West Loop. The city's iconic architecture gave way to an eerie calm. We found entire blocks deserted, with shops and restaurants that still had signs in the windows, as if they'd open tomorrow. But the sidewalks were cluttered with debris, and every so often we'd spot an infected figure lurching behind a locked door or a window. We never let our guard down. Once we found ourselves surrounded by half a dozen infected at an intersection. There was no good place to hide, so we made a run for it, dashing across the street, hearts pounding. Travis nearly tripped, but Joe hauled him up, and we made it to a side street unscathed. We had a small victory when we discovered a partially functional sedan in a parking garage. The battery was weak, but Jordan managed to jumpstart it, using a kit we found in the trunk of another car. We piled in, but soon realized the tank was nearly empty, and the roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles. After a few blocks, we had to ditch it. We kept moving on foot, forging through side streets. Each of these setbacks stung, but we pressed on, reasoning that anywhere had to be safer than a city full of infected. We whispered about the rumored perimeter along I-294, about O'Hare's cargo terminal, about hidden pockets of survivors. We had no proof any of it was real. We walked anyway. On August 30th, we reached the near west side. A few neighborhoods looked devastated by fires, rows of burned-out apartments. The smell was dreadful. We quickly bypassed those areas, stumbling over scorched rubble. Joe got a cut on his arm from some twisted metal, so we stopped at an abandoned clinic to clean and bandage it. Every corner felt like a potential ambush, but we found some leftover medical supplies, enough to keep infection at bay, the normal kind of infection, not the terrifying virus that had undone civilization. Through the shortwave, we still heard flickers of transmissions, though the voices were faint. Words like evacuating, containment, moving south. None of it gave us a clear path. But Jordan suggested we keep scanning. Maybe we'd stumble on a stronger signal the further west we got. On top of that, we had the portable transmitter. We decided we'd try to broadcast once we found a safe place to hunker down. Maybe just for a few minutes. Remind anyone listening that people were still alive. That was how we ended up in an old warehouse near Ashland Avenue for a few nights, rummaging for supplies and hooking the transmitter up to a salvaged car battery. We aired a short message. This is the group formerly at 103.8 WCTD in downtown Chicago. We're alive, heading west, searching for a safe zone. If you hear this, and you're out there, you're not alone. We got static in response. We kept repeating it anyway. In early September, though we'd lost track of the exact date, we reached the edge of the medical district near Stroger Hospital. The sight was grim. Ambulances overturned, windows smashed, infected figures roaming the parking lots. Some wore tattered medical scrubs or lab coats. I swallowed a lump in my throat, thinking of Diana. If she had been here... No, I didn't want to dwell on that. We moved on. The hospital was obviously overrun. The last thing we wanted was to wade into a crowd of infected. We circled around, hugging side streets. Eventually, we found an unblocked route that led us further west toward the old neighborhoods near Cicero. By this time, our group had become a tightly knit team. Bethany kept morale up by leading small check-in discussions each morning. "How's everyone feeling? How's your water supply? Any injuries?" Joe, always stoic, reassured us that he'd keep watch. Travis scouted ahead on foot, looking around each corner before waving us forward. Jordan and I studied old paper maps, trying to plan routes that avoided the biggest roads. At night, we told each other stories about our old lives, our families, and the little joys we missed. Fresh coffee, a clean shower, the bustle of normal city crowds. Eventually, near Cicero Avenue, we found an office park that seemed mostly intact. A tall chain-link fence surrounded a parking lot filled with old cars. The building itself, maybe 4 stories tall, had tinted windows that were all unbroken. It felt too good to be true, but we had to investigate. We carefully scaled the fence, landing inside. No immediate sign of infected. Joe forced open a side door. The place smelled stale, but not rotten. We checked each floor, seeing evidence that some people had once tried to hold out there. Discarded sleeping bags, a few half-eaten rations. But it was deserted now. We decided to stay for a while. We barricaded the doors, posted watchers at every entrance. Travis found a small stash of bottled water in a storage room. Bethany discovered a break room with dried goods, crackers, instant oatmeal, even some dehydrated soup mix. Jordan found a rooftop solar array that had apparently been part of an eco-friendly initiative. The main batteries were nearly empty, but he thought we could charge them a bit each day if the panels still functioned. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. For the first time since leaving downtown, we slept in relative comfort. Actual cots, actual blankets. We took turns standing guard at night. Over the next few days, we began to fortify that office building as best we could. We jammed the elevator doors just in case infected got inside. We set up tripwires made from cans and metal scraps at the main entrances so we'd hear if something tried to sneak in. Jordan carefully reconnected a portion of the rooftop solar array to a small battery, letting us power the shortwave radio and portable transmitter for brief intervals. We started broadcasting again. Every afternoon around 3 p.m., we'd air a short message. This is Marcus Alvarez with a small group of survivors broadcasting from near Cicero Avenue. If you hear our voice, know that you're not alone. We have limited supplies, but we welcome anyone who can make it safely. Then we'd go silent to conserve energy. We got no direct replies at first, but at least we felt stable. We had water, we had some food, and the infected presence seemed lighter in this area. We saw a few wandering the streets beyond the fence, but they didn't come near. Maybe they were following noise elsewhere, or maybe the city was emptier this far out. We half dared to imagine that we could stay here long term, planting the seeds from Bethany's greenhouse in the small patches of dirt around the parking lot. But we all knew we couldn't remain isolated forever. If the infected found us, or if we started running low on supplies, or if the solar array finally gave out, we'd be stuck. Meanwhile, the rumors of a perimeter beyond the city beckoned. If we could just reach it, maybe we'd find a real safe zone, with medical care, more robust defenses, and possibly a chance to reconnect with whatever remained of the outside world. We weighed the pros and cons constantly. By mid-September, we began picking up more shortwave chatter, references to suburban safe spots in places like Oak Park, Maywood, or even further west near Elmhurst. Some transmissions sounded panicked, describing encounters with infected hordes. Others were coded or muffled, as if entire communities feared announcing their location openly. The city was a patchwork of survivors, each uncertain whom to trust, each day a fight to endure. Even so, hearing those fragmented voices gave us hope. We weren't alone. We decided to attempt a day trip, a scouting excursion beyond Cicero, to see if we could confirm any of these rumored safe communities. On the morning of September 20th, Joe, Travis, and I set out on foot, leaving Bethany and Jordan behind to guard the office building. We promised to be back by nightfall. We moved quietly along side streets, encountering only a few infected. Most were alone or in pairs, easy to avoid. We spotted deserted stores, battered gas stations, a few neighborhoods that looked like they'd been ransacked long ago. Yet we found no sign of an organized shelter. By late afternoon, we had to return, bringing only a few scavenged snacks and some antiseptic wipes from an abandoned pharmacy. We broadcast a report that night. No confirmed shelters nearby. We'll keep looking. Over the next week, we tried again. This time we went slightly further, following Travis's instinct to check a local high school that had once been rumored to host an evacuation site. We walked for 2 hours, stepping over caved-in sidewalks, passing a collapsed billboard that read, "We are Chicago Strong." At last, we saw the school, a large brick building with barricades near the entrance. We crouched behind a car, scanning the grounds. It was quiet. No lights, no movement. We inched closer. The barricades were old, possibly set up weeks ago. Inside the courtyard, we spotted a cluster of makeshift tents, but no people. A musty smell lingered in the air, and a sense of dread crept over me. We heard a faint shuffling noise from behind the gates. Nervous, we called out, "Hello? Anyone?" That was a mistake. A moment later, we saw infected figures lurch out of those tents, a half dozen, maybe more. They turned our way, moaning, arms rising. "Go, go," Joe hissed. And we sprinted back the way we came, hearts in our throats. The infected followed, but we had a head start. After a few blocks that they were nowhere in sight, and we didn't slow down until we reached an empty park. We ducked behind some bushes, panting. Travis muttered, "Guess that shelter didn't last." The reality sank in. So many of these rumored safe havens had been overrun. We were running out of leads. We returned to the office building around sunset, feeling dejected. Bethany and Jordan took the news in stride, though disappointment was clear in their eyes. That night, we took comfort in the meager security of our new home. Jordan tried to raise more signals on the shortwave, but we got static or garbled transmissions. I broadcast a brief update. No luck at the high school site. The city is still dangerous. We'll remain here for a while. Life in that building settled into a routine. We'd wake, share a sparse meal, stand watch in pairs, do an inventory of supplies, then do short scavenging runs within a few blocks. We found an old automotive repair shop with a working hand pump for water. We discovered a small corner store that hadn't been fully looted, still had some canned fruit on the shelves. Each success felt like a triumph. We'd celebrate by cooking a simple meal over a portable camp stove we discovered in a manager's office. Over time, we formed an odd family, 5 people from disparate backgrounds, united by the will to keep each other alive. Occasionally, we encountered other survivors in the area. Some looked at us with terror or suspicion. We tried to share what we had or invite them to join us, but many declined, preferring solitude or fearing betrayal. A few were friendlier, staying long enough to rest before moving on. One older man, wearing a torn winter coat in the middle of September, told us about a rumored farmland collective near the outskirts of Cook County. We asked for directions, but he only knew a vague route. We debated whether to go, but decided we didn't have enough solid info. The man set off the next morning, leaving us behind with a silent wave. Days turned into weeks. The infected presence around our building stayed minimal, perhaps because it was a quiet neighborhood, and we made sure never to draw attention. We had close calls, but nothing catastrophic. Yet the emptiness weighed on us. Late one night, I found myself pacing the roof, staring at the sky. The city lights, once bright, were gone. The stars above Chicago looked sharper than I ever remembered. I spoke softly into the night. "Diana, I hope you're under these same stars somewhere. I hope you're alive." The breeze carried no answer. On a crisp morning that might have been in early October by our rough count, Jordan hurried inside from a short scouting run, breathless. "I saw a convoy." We snapped to attention. "They were on a side road, about a mile west," he continued. "Looked like trucks. Real trucks, not just random cars. Maybe 4 or 5. Headed north." We peppered him with questions. Who were they? How many infected were around? What direction exactly? Jordan shook his head, saying he'd only caught a quick glimpse before they disappeared. But the idea of a convoy was electrifying. It meant an organized group, maybe the National Guard or well-armed survivors. We decided we had to check it out. If there really were vehicles heading north, maybe they'd be open to picking up more survivors. Or maybe they were a roving threat. Either way, we couldn't just ignore it. So a few hours later, the 5 of us gathered our gear and set out in that direction, leaving our building shuttered. We walked carefully, scanning every block. Travis took point, scouting with binoculars. By late afternoon, we found an industrial stretch where Jordan said he'd spotted the trucks. The ground was littered with tire tracks, some fresh. We followed them until they turned onto a major road, but there we found only an empty intersection. No sign of a convoy. We split up to search the area, staying within shouting distance. Bethany found a discarded water bottle near the curb, which we took as proof that people had come through recently, but nothing else. We spent a tense night holed up in an abandoned warehouse, hoping maybe the convoy would return or leave a sign. We saw no one. At dawn, we gave up and returned to our building. The disappointment gnawed at us, but the faint evidence of something bigger out there stayed in our minds. Hope was a double-edged sword. Despite these ups and downs, we persevered. We improved our makeshift garden in the building's front courtyard using seeds from Bethany's greenhouse kit. The crops were tiny but symbolically enormous. We learned how to rig a more reliable water filter using charcoal and sand from the roof planters. We expanded our broadcast times whenever the solar-charged battery allowed, sometimes telling stories or playing old recordings from WCTD archives. Maybe no one was listening, but it gave us a purpose. And through it all, Diana remained at the forefront of my mind. I mentioned her in nearly every broadcast, just a sentence or two in case she was out there with a radio. Diana, I'm at the office building near Cicero, if you can hear me. Some nights, that was the only thing that kept me from despair. As autumn deepened, the air grew colder. We noticed a drop in infected activity, perhaps because the nights were long and the city's weather turned bitter. We had to layer up, scavenging jackets from empty stores. Our building's heat was long gone. We'd sometimes burn scraps of wood in a metal trash can on the roof for warmth, though we had to be mindful of smoke. More than once we spotted infected drifting around outside as though curious about the flickering glow. One morning, Joe approached me while I was fiddling with the portable transmitter. He cleared his throat. "Marcus, I've been thinking. Winter in Chicago is brutal. We can't keep living in this building with no heat. If the freeze sets in, we'll be in trouble." I nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. He continued, "We should consider moving again. Maybe find a place with a bigger generator, or where we can gather wood for fires." The idea had merit. Bethany and Jordan, overhearing, agreed that we should make a plan before the first major snowfall. So we hashed out a strategy. Sometime soon, we'd pack our most vital supplies and head further west, searching for a less urban region or even farmland where we might safely ride out the winter. Travis insisted we try to find other survivors or leads on established communities. Jordan said he'd do everything he could to keep our portable gear functional. Bethany said we needed at least a few days to gather all we'd need for a trek. We agreed, deciding we'd aim to leave by the end of the week. That evening, we made one final extended broadcast from our building's rooftop. Using the shortwave plus the portable transmitter, we looped the message. "We are a group of 5 survivors in Chicago, near Cicero Avenue, planning to travel west in search of stable ground. If you receive this message, we encourage you to do the same. Head toward areas with fewer infected if you can. Help each other. We'll keep broadcasting as we go if possible. Stay safe, everyone." We spent the next few days in a flurry of preparation. Bethany meticulously rationed food for the journey. Travis mapped potential routes, marking possible safe rest stops. Jordan rechecked the solar array, making sure we could charge the battery on the move. Joe built a small cart out of a rolling desk to carry heavier supplies. I walked through the building, feeling a pang of loss for this place that had sheltered us. We left behind some notes in case anyone else came by, where we'd gone, what direction we traveled. Finally, the day came. We slipped out just after dawn, the sun casting long shadows across the battered streets. The 5 of us trudged west, hearts pounding with the weight of the unknown. We had no illusions that it would be easy, but we also had each other, and that was something. As we left that office building behind, I felt a surge of gratitude. Grateful to still be alive, grateful for my companions, grateful for the flickering hope that Diana might be somewhere out there waiting, surviving. If she was, I'd find her, or she'd find me. I clung to that belief as tightly as I clutched the crowbar in my hand. Our journey continued like this for countless days. We maneuvered through the sprawl of western Chicago, stepping over broken pavement, weaving around stranded buses, occasionally spotting stray infected. We moved in silence, communicating by gesture, tapping each other's shoulders when danger was near. We discovered pockets of relative calm, blocks that seemed deserted for good with no infected in sight, and pockets of devastation, burnt-out subdivisions, entire parking lots filled with abandoned vehicles. Whenever possible, we'd salvage more supplies, an unopened bag of rice, a half case of bottled water, an old toolkit with a hammer and nails. Each find could be the difference between life and death later on. Sometimes we found other survivors, or at least signs of them. Piles of fresh trash, newly placed barricades, messages scrawled on walls like, "We've gone south," or "Safe to stay here." We tried to approach carefully, but many were skittish. We offered to share knowledge, never wanting to appear threatening. Some joined us for a night, then parted ways in the morning. Others wanted no company. A handful were in rough shape, physically or mentally, muttering that it was all hopeless. We encouraged them to keep going, but we couldn't force them. All of these meetings reminded us that humanity was scattered, not extinct. Whenever we paused for more than a day, Jordan would rig the solar panel and I'd do a short broadcast. My message became a kind of mantra. This is Marcus Alvarez, with a group of survivors continuing west in search of a stable refuge. If you hear us, know that you aren't alone. I also continued calling out for Diana. Even if it felt like shouting into a void, I had to keep that door open. Weeks turned into months, or so we guessed, as the weather grew colder. The infected were less visible, either slowed by the dropping temperatures or drawn to other areas in search of whatever sense of motion or living presence they hunted. We had close calls, but we learned how to defend ourselves with minimal noise. Joe fashioned a makeshift spear from pipe and a sharpened metal rod. Bethany's baseball bat became legendary in our little group. She was calm, but fierce if threatened. Travis improved his stealth, creeping ahead on scouting runs, returning with intel that saved us from walking into dangerous zones. Jordan kept our gear operational, though we lost a solar panel at one point when it fell and cracked. As for me, I became the historian of sorts, using a stack of notebooks to record everything we discovered, from safe routes to local rumors. I wrote about the people we met, the places we passed, the heartbreak of seeing entire neighborhoods abandoned. Sometimes at night I'd scrawl passages about Diana or about my parents. Were they still out there? My father had talked about wanting to retire to a place in Indiana. Did they make it out before the city went dark? It was all unknown. We never found a grand rescue operation, no official convoys, no bulletproof fortress of safety. But we did find a series of small communities, each doing its best. Some were more functional than others. One had a rudimentary farming setup, another had a generator and a watchtower. We stayed briefly at each, trading labor for supplies, offering our broadcasting gear to relay messages. It felt almost like going from village to village in some medieval age, forging alliances. In each settlement, we repeated the same question. Have you heard of anyone named Diana Alvarez, paramedic with the CFD? And each time we got shrugs or shakes of the head. But no one said, yes, I've seen her. The emptiness that followed was something I learned to swallow. I never let it crush me. Hope was too precious to lose. All the while, I kept the spirit of 103.8 alive in my voice. Even if the official station was gone, I used that frequency whenever we had the chance, hooking up our portable transmitter. I'd introduce myself as Marcus Alvarez from 103.8, now traveling with a small group. We'd remind people how to distill water, how to keep quiet to avoid drawing infected, how to find emergency medical supplies in abandoned clinics or offices. We told them that if we could survive, they could too. But the road ahead was long, and each new day brought challenges I couldn't have imagined back when I was holed up in the Metcalf building. The city receded behind us, but so did any semblance of the life we'd known. Time felt strange, as if we were living outside of what used to be normal. We no longer measured days by calendar dates. We measured them by how many times we had to hide from infected, how many times we managed to gather enough food for another week, how many new voices we found on the shortwave. We traveled west, heading deeper into suburban sprawl. Some areas looked eerily untouched, as though folks just vanished midday, leaving behind children's toys in yards and half-finished meals on kitchen tables. Other blocks had been ravaged by fires or marauders, shelves stripped, windows smashed, the smell of soot lingering in the air. We never knew which scene we'd stumble across next. Occasionally, we'd run into a single infected shambling aimlessly, arms limp at its sides. Sometimes they traveled in packs of 3 or 4. We made it a strict rule to avoid confrontation whenever possible. We didn't have endless ammunition or medical supplies, and the noise of a fight could draw far more trouble. Our group, myself, Joe, Bethany, Jordan, and Travis, had become a tight-knit unit. We moved with a quiet efficiency, scanning every corner, speaking in hushed tones. On days when we felt safe enough, we'd allow ourselves a bit of conversation, reminiscing about the city or swapping stories of our old neighborhoods. Bethany often told us about her life before. She'd lived in Aurora, commuting to Chicago for her office manager job. She laughed about how she used to complain that the expressway was too congested, ironically wishing for a little less traffic. Now, the highways were empty save for abandoned cars and debris. Jordan, the electrician, reminisced about how he used to fix wiring at apartment complexes, complaining about how old the fuse boxes were in some of the city's older buildings. Now that knowledge saved us time and again. He taught us how to jerry-rig solar panels, fix a short in a car battery, patch wiring to create a single flickering light bulb in an otherwise dark world. Travis, the youngest of us, had big dreams of becoming a lawyer. He'd studied at a local college, snagged an internship at a downtown firm, then everything imploded. Yet he kept that spark of optimism, as if the outbreak hadn't crushed his spirit entirely. He was the first to volunteer for scouting missions, always yearning to see something new or glean some fresh intel from an abandoned building. Joe was steady, a calm presence who rarely wasted words. He'd been a maintenance staffer in the Metcalf building and somehow managed to hold on to a sense of responsibility for all of us, like we were his extended family. If something broke, he tried to fix it. If we were afraid, he was the first to say, "We'll figure it out." And me? Well, I was the voice of our small tribe. But I felt like more than that now. After all these miles, these nights spent in half-collapsed houses or behind barricaded doors, we'd each become more adaptable than we thought possible. Even my longing for Diana, which sometimes left me breathless with sorrow, pushed me forward. I had to believe she was out there, maybe broadcasting on another frequency or tending to survivors in need. In my quieter moments, I imagined hearing her voice across the static. "Marcus, I'm safe. I'll find you." Over time, we discovered that not everyone had fled or been overrun. There were clusters of survivors scattered across the suburbs, each forming a tiny ecosystem with its own rules and resources. Some we only heard about through rumor, others we encountered by chance. We made it our mission to share these rumors on the air when we could, disclaimers included. "We can't confirm the status of these groups," I'd say into the microphone, "but if you're in the area, keep an eye out for fellow survivors. Help if you can. We're all in this together." Even though much of the city and suburbs lay behind us, the region was vast. We found ourselves looping around certain areas. Sometimes we'd backtrack to avoid heavy, infected presence or to circle a major expressway jam. By the time we got near Elmhurst, the days had shortened, the nights crisp with the onset of late autumn. After a long stretch of wandering, we stumbled on a small office park called Brentwood right off a quiet side road. The sign by the entrance was cracked, and the shrubs around it were overgrown, but the buildings inside looked relatively intact. 4 separate office structures, each 2 stories tall, arranged in a square around a grassy courtyard. A chain-link fence surrounded the whole complex, likely for corporate security or privacy back before the outbreak. We entered cautiously, expecting infected, but we didn't see any. Instead, we found the front gate sealed shut with a massive padlock. Joe pried it open with his crowbar, the metal screeching in protest while the rest of us stayed alert. Once inside, we were greeted by rows of parked cars, many with their windows intact. It felt eerie, like everyone had just gone home early one Friday and never returned. In the courtyard, we saw signs of life, well-tended planters of tomato vines, a plastic barrel for collecting rainwater, footprints in the dirt. Our pulses quickened. Survivors were here. But where were they now? Bethany called out gently, "Hello? Anyone?" Her voice echoed off the building walls, but no one answered. We decided to search the first office structure. The glass door was locked, so Travis picked it with a small toolkit he carried. Inside, the reception area was neat, dusty but not ransacked. A few motivational posters hung on the walls. A row of office chairs still lined the waiting area, some with jackets draped across them. We advanced in a tight formation, each with a weapon ready. Everything was silent, save for the hum of a faint breeze through a cracked window. Then, from somewhere in the back, we heard a muffled sound. Footsteps? We froze. Joe gestured for us to wait while he stepped forward, calling out, "We're not infected. We're just travelers." A pause. Then a voice. "That's close enough." A figure emerged at the end of the corridor. A woman, maybe in her 40s, holding a hunting rifle. Her eyes were wide, uncertain. She kept the barrel pointed down but didn't relax. Behind her, another person peeked out, clutching a kitchen knife. "We're not looking for trouble," Joe said. "Just a safe place." We raised our hands, letting them see we had no intention of attacking. The woman studied us for a long moment, then exhaled, shoulders slumping a little. "All right," she said, still cautious. "You're not the first. Been a while, though." It turned out her name was Maxine, and the younger person behind her was her niece, Tara, about 19. They'd been living in Brentwood Office Park for weeks, joined by a small handful of others who'd come and gone. The complex had a working generator in the basement of Building C, plus a secure fence that kept out most infected. They grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and a few herbs in the courtyard. Rainwater from the roof drains gave them drinking water. Maxine took us to a lounge area with a few cots set up, explaining that some travelers had stayed a while, then moved on in search of family. "We're not exactly a settlement," she said, "but it's decent here if you don't mind scrounging." We keep the generator off most of the time to save fuel. We only run it to charge batteries or power up the lights once in a while. Jordan practically lit up at the mention of a generator. Maybe I can help maintain it, he offered. Maxine shrugged warily, as if she'd heard big promises before. For a day or two, we stuck around, grateful for a break from constant wandering. The office park felt weirdly normal. A row of cubicles, a small kitchenette with instant coffee, even a break room TV that once displayed morning news. We set up in an unused corner office with windows that overlooked the courtyard. It felt downright luxurious compared to the ramshackle hideouts we'd used before. Maxine, Tara, and a few other survivors, Howard, an older gentleman with a limp, and Marisol, a teacher from Indiana who'd lost track of her family, welcomed us politely enough. They seemed relieved to see a group with actual skills, especially Jordan's electrician know-how. And we had the portable transmitter. Once they realized we weren't bandits or troublemakers, they let us settle in. Living near others again was a relief, but it also came with friction. We discovered that some in Brentwood clashed over how to manage their limited supplies. Maxine believed that everyone should pitch in equally, from food gathering to fence repairs. Tara thought they should store the best supplies in a locked closet, just in case. Howard wanted to hunt for more seeds, possibly trading with a rumored group up north, though no one could confirm if that group existed. Marisol wanted to keep a low profile, worried that broadcasting might attract hostile outsiders. When we mentioned we were continuing to broadcast, Marisol frowned. I get it, you want to help people, but you might also bring the wrong kind of people here. Looters, or just desperate folks who could turn violent. I stood my ground, explaining how our transmissions had saved lives before, how we guided fellow survivors to water or medical supplies. Joe backed me up, reminding everyone that in times like these, hiding forever might not be the best strategy. If we all hole up and never connect, he said, we'll just die off, one by one. Eventually, a compromise formed. We could broadcast, but only if we avoided giving specific coordinates for Brentwood. We'd remain vague, describing general region info rather than pinning down the exact location. That way, we could share knowledge without painting a target on the office park. While rummaging through the basement storerooms, Travis found a half-functional shortwave set more powerful than our portable one, apparently part of the old building's security system. With Jordan's help, we managed to get it partially online, hooking it to the generator for power. The range was better than anything we'd used in months. We started hearing all sorts of chatter from distant areas, though much was still static. One night, as we cycled through the frequencies, we caught a faint voice repeating, "This is Overland Refuge, broadcasting for any survivors. We have partial medical staff and farmland. Please respond." It repeated every few minutes like a looped recording. Jordan practically jumped out of his chair. "Did you hear that? Medical staff. Farmland." We scrambled to respond, but our words disappeared into static. We tried adjusting dials, shifting frequencies. The best we could do was a short burst, maybe 5 or 6 words, before losing the signal. "Overland Refuge. We hear you." Then nothing. We didn't even know where Overland Refuge was or how to reach it, but that single phrase, partial medical staff and farmland, clung to us like a lifeline. Maxine, overhearing, scoffed softly. "Could be a trick. People do that sometimes, lure you in." She seemed haunted by some past betrayal. But Joe said, "Or it could be real. Maybe they want to help." In a brief meeting, we decided we'd keep trying to contact them. If we could lock onto that broadcast again, maybe we'd glean more details. Meanwhile, we found more references to Overland Refuge on other frequencies. Some survivors mentioned it in passing, describing it as somewhere west of the city, near farmland. That was hardly specific, but it was a clue. Over the following weeks, Brentwood Office Park became a temporary sanctuary for more travelers. Word spread quietly among the highways and back roads. A small group had a safe fence, a generator, some food, no major infected problem. People trickled in. A mother and her teenage son, a solitary ex-truck driver, 2 exhausted paramedics from Gary who said they lost their ambulance in a crash. At first, Maxine and the others were wary, but we convinced them that more hands could strengthen the place, so long as everyone pulled their weight. Before we knew it, the population swelled to about 15. We rationed water carefully, assigned chores, and stepped up security. We discovered a small horticulture shop across the highway that had seeds, potting soil, and tools we could use to expand the courtyard garden. Joe and I made daily treks for supplies, sometimes bringing along new folks who wanted to help. But with more people came more noise, and that eventually drew the attention of infected. We started seeing them wandering around the exterior fence, pressing their decaying faces against the chain link. Some nights they'd gather in clusters, moaning softly. By dawn, they'd drift away if we kept quiet enough, but it was nerve-wracking. A single mistake could result in them pushing through. We also faced an unexpected new threat. Other humans. There were rumors of groups roving in trucks, raiding small settlements for supplies. We heard they might be ex-military or just desperate people banding together. Our fear was that one day, these trucks might roll up to Brentwood, see the lush courtyard plants, and decide it was easier to take our resources than trade for them. One late afternoon, as we were working in the courtyard, we heard the rumble of engines. Everyone froze. From behind a row of trees, 2 pickup trucks appeared, rolling slowly onto the main road near the office park entrance. We saw figures in the truck beds armed with what looked like rifles. Maxine signaled for everyone to take cover behind the planters. Joe and I dashed to a vantage point on the second floor of Building A, peering out a window. The truck stopped at the chain-link fence, engines idling. A man in the passenger seat of the lead truck stood up, scanning our courtyard. He was tall, with a shaved head, wearing a heavy jacket. He called out, voice echoing across the asphalt. "We see you, folks. We're not infected, but we're looking for supplies." Maxine and Howard emerged from Building B with cautious steps. "We don't have much to spare," Maxine replied. "We have a community here. We're not looking for conflict." The man chuckled. "No conflict, huh? I see you've got plants, water barrels. We're open to a trade." He paused meaningfully. "But if you don't have anything we want, we might just help ourselves." A tense hush fell. I noticed the rifles in the trucks, realized how outmatched we'd be in a firefight. Joe gripped my shoulder, whispering, "Stay low." We didn't want to escalate. Maxine tried to keep her voice calm. "What do you need?" The man shouted back, "Fuel, ammo, food, medical supplies if you have it." We didn't have much ammo beyond a few scavenged rounds. Fuel was precious. Food was limited, but we had built a small stockpile of first aid items. Marisol, the teacher from Indiana, quietly advised Maxine to see if we could part with some bandages, disinfectant, maybe a little fuel. But how to ensure they didn't just come back demanding more next time? After a quiet discussion, Maxine, Howard, and 2 others unlocked the gate partially, letting the man and 1 companion enter on foot, unarmed, or so we insisted. We tried to keep the situation civil, tension taut like a wire. They browsed what we offered. A few jerry cans of gas, a portion of dried foods, some medical kits. They wanted more, but Maxine held firm. "This is all we can afford to give. We have mouths to feed." A standoff loomed, the man's eyes narrowing. But after a long moment, he shrugged. "All right," he conceded. "We'll take it. Fair enough." Before leaving, he locked eyes with Maxine. "We'll be around," he said cryptically, then hopped into the truck. The engines roared, and the convoy disappeared down the road. A collective sigh of relief swept through our camp, but the underlying fear remained. What if they came back, wanting more? In the wake of that visit, the group at Brentwood split into different viewpoints. Some believed we should fortify further, investing in stronger defenses, maybe even forming an armed patrol to guard the perimeter at all times. Others argued it was safer to pack up and disperse before bigger, more hostile gangs showed up. The infected were one thing, but people armed with rifles were another level of danger. Meanwhile, my small band, me, Joe, Bethany, Jordan, and Travis, debated whether it was time to move on. We'd grown attached to Brentwood, but we also remembered the faint transmissions about Overland Refuge. If such a place existed, with farmland and medical staff, maybe it could become a real stronghold against raiders and infected alike. Jordan was torn. He'd poured a lot of effort into upgrading the generator, wiring lights in the courtyard, making the place feel more livable. Travis seemed restless, though, as if he wanted to keep searching beyond these office buildings. Bethany felt safer here than anywhere else we'd been, but she also recognized the potential threat from that truck convoy. Joe was stoic, as always, ready to do whatever the group decided. Late one night, the 5 of us sat on the second-floor balcony, gazing at the courtyard below. The breeze carried the faint smell of tomatoes and damp earth. "We've done good things here," Bethany said quietly. "But are we just waiting for something bad to happen?" Travis shrugged. "We can't predict the future. This place might hold, or it might collapse if more raiders show up." I voiced my own ambivalence. Broadcasting from here has helped a few survivors find refuge, but it also puts us on the map for groups like that convoy. Joe leaned forward. "What if we took a smaller expedition to look for Overland Refuge? If it's real, we come back with proof or bring everyone. If it's not, we'll have to double down here." Jordan perked up. "That's not a bad idea. A scouting mission, short term. We can't all go, though. Brentwood needs defenders." but a few of us could slip out, gather intel. We agreed that I should be part of this mission since I was the one who overheard Overland's broadcast in the first place. Travis volunteered instantly, eager for an adventure. Bethany offered, but we worried about leaving Jordan behind as the only engineer type. She ended up deciding to stay and help keep Brentwood's systems going alongside Jordan, while Joe insisted he'd come with me. "Can't let you and Travis wander off alone," he said. "Safety in numbers." So we formed a small team of 3, me, Joe, and Travis. We'd set out in the morning, traveling light, with just enough supplies for a few days. If we didn't find anything, we'd return. If we did, well, we'd see. Here's a shortened and satisfying final segment for your story, preserving the tone and emotional weight of the ending while providing closure. At dawn, we left Brentwood with light packs and heavy hopes. It was just me, Joe, and Travis, heading west in search of overland refuge. We had little more than water, dried food, a shortwave receiver, and my old handheld transmitter. The suburbs stretched ahead like a maze of memory and ruin. Still, we pressed on. After days of careful travel, a half-buried road sign led us to Maple Hills, a ghost town with overgrown lawns and shattered windows. It felt like a dead end, until Joe found a dusty map in an abandoned police station. One name jumped out: Overland Acres. It was scrawled on the far edge of the town, next to rows of farmland. Our hearts kicked up. Could this be it? The sun was setting when we reached the gates. A faded wooden sign welcomed us. Overland Acres, established 1943. We called out cautiously, and after a tense pause, someone answered. His name was Tom Whitaker. He and a handful of survivors had been trying to rebuild. Yes, they had farmland. Yes, they had medical help. And yes, they'd tried broadcasting. The generator had been failing, but the message had gotten out. Overland Refuge was real. We stayed a week, helped on the farm, shared meals, told stories, repaired fences. It felt like the beginnings of something bigger. Then we made our way back to Brentwood with Tom and a few of his people, their truck packed with vegetables and hope. When we rolled through the gates, Bethany and Jordan ran to meet us. We told them everything. They listened, wide-eyed. In the days that followed, we made a decision. Brentwood and Overland would work together. Trade routes, shared skills, a rotating guard, a signal to draw others in. A few weeks later, with Jordan's help, we got the old broadcast station at Overland up and running, solar-powered, stronger than anything we'd had before. We salvaged the battered WCTD sign from my bag and tacked it above the mic. When the red light turned on, I leaned into the mic and spoke, voice steady for the first time in a long time. "This is Marcus Alvarez, once of 103.8 FM Chicago, now broadcasting from Overland Refuge. If you're hearing this, you've survived. We have food, shelter, people who care. We're rebuilding, step by step. If you're out there, keep going. Find Brentwood. We'll meet you there and guide you home." I paused, then added softer. "Diana, if you're out there, I'm still here. I'll be here every day until I hear your voice again." Static followed, then silence, then a spark of something new. That night, as snow fell across the fields, we gathered around the fire. Survivors, farmers, fighters, neighbors. A new kind of family. And as I looked out over the dark countryside, dotted with lanterns and whispers and life, I finally allowed myself to believe what I hadn't dared since the day Chicago fell. This world may never be what it was, but it's not over, not yet.